And this is very common in the language of people who are dying. They refer to this kind of mysterious this or it. Or, like one person in a coma said to their loved one, they came out of the coma, turned to them and said, "It's not what you think."
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Using words in one language or another is an integral part of modern human existence. I mean, can you imagine how life would be different if we didn't have words? But what happens when language gets a little wacky, like Jim Morrison on LSD kind of wacky? And why might the language get stranger as we're nearing death? I'm so excited for you to tune in and drop in with me and my guest today. Things are about to get a little bit weird. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today, I'm here with Lisa Smartt, who's a linguist, a book coach, and a writer. She's the author of Words at the Threshold, What We Say When We're Nearing Death. The book is based on data collected through the Final Words Project, an ongoing study devoted to gathering and interpreting the mysterious language at the end of life. She's worked closely with Raymond Moody, guided by his research into language, particularly unintelligible speech. They have co-facilitated presentations about language and consciousness at universities, hospices, and conferences. Lisa has also written Cante Bardo, Veil, Diet for a Broken Heart, and Lessons in Lullabies. Thank you so much for being here today, Lisa. I'm looking forward to diving in on a topic that really kind of scares me and intrigues me at the same time.
Great. Well, it's great to be here, Heather. Thank you.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like people say some pretty amazing things when they're close to dying. And this is a very, scary and intriguing topic for me because I don't want to think about the fact that I'm going to die someday. And that feels really scary to even contemplate. But you have kind of dove into this in a very interesting way. You're a linguist, a writer, and a book coach, and you've studied the words of the dying. And through this project, the Final Words Project. So what is this Final Word Project and how did you come to establish it?
Well, the Final Words Project studies people's final words. And like you, years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was terrified of death and dying. And I had not imagined that I would be sitting here speaking to someone on a podcast about people's final words. What happened is I love language. And as you said, I was trained as a linguist. And when I was 52, my father had a very quick turn of events. He was just getting a pretty routine treatment for prostate cancer, and they over-radiated him. And he got a very, very large dose of radiation that he was not supposed to receive. And this landed up giving him a very serious infection, which then resulted in him dying 3 weeks later. And my mother brought him, after he was in the hospital, she brought him home. And that evening, he walked out the front door in his underwear and on a January night. And when the police stopped him and asked what was going on, he said that he was headed for the big art exhibition. And he was holding boxes and bringing them for my mother, who was an artist, for the big art show. Well, indeed, of course, there was no art show in the middle of the night, but my father began to go on and announcing this big event. And that moment completely was the moment that would change my life. Because after that, I came back home and would spend every hours and hours at his bedside listening to a man who was deeply altered as people who are dying often are, not always, but often. And I began to record everything that he said. And what seemed like complete nonsense, my dad talking about an art show in the middle of the night, I came to find to be something very common that happens as people are dying, that they announce that some big event is coming. And that big event is often very closely associated with the narratives of their lives, the things that mattered to them. So for 50 something years, my father helped my mother who was an artist, set up her art shows. And so the big event was coming, and that big event turned out to be his passing on. And that happens frequently. So in those 3 weeks that I was at his bedside, I started collecting all the remarkable and stunning and oftentimes nonsensical things that he said. And that collection of language made me really curious to find out more about people's final words.
Wow. What an incredible observation, and the curiosity that you had for that. And just so happy that you had that curiosity to be able to bring this really important subject to the listeners today. To me, I'm so excited to dive into this with you. And I think studied with someone named Raymond Moody, who I'm actually not familiar with his work, but it sounds like he's the person who coined the term near-death experience.
Yes. So when I was 17 years old, I'm 61 now, I think it was 1976 that his book came out, Life After Life. And he was the doctor who first coined the term near-death experience. And he was an atheist, didn't believe in God, didn't have any religious agenda. And he was also a skeptic. He was a highly scientific individual and very critically minded. However, he noticed that the patients who had cardiac arrest, who died and returned, who he was able to resuscitate, would come back with these really remarkable accounts of what happened. And until then, most physicians who heard this, or even nurses often, would completely discount the things that people would share as just them being crazy or medication, or, they're just delirious. But what Raymond also had a PhD in philosophy. And when he was studying philosophy, he studied nonsense, unintelligible language, or language that we consider nonsense. And what he discovered in his research as a philosopher is that nonsense has very clear patterns. That even though, we think of nonsense as being completely random and having no meaning, it actually turns out that nonsensical language has its own kind of organization. So knowing that, being a doctor of philosophy, when he became a medical doctor and he heard these patients with these saying things that other professionals were saying, oh, it's just nonsense, he decided to kind of do what I landed up doing with the final words. He began to write down the things that his patients said. And guess what he discovered? That those things that people had dismissed as being nonsensical began to fall into very specific categories. So, for example, he noticed that a large majority of the patients who had died and come back and reported having an experience would all explain the same thing happened to them. They moved out of their bodies, they left their bodies, and looked down at themselves. Now, you have to realize back in the 70s, this was not mainstream scientifically accepted experience, this whole, moving out of your body and looking down. Now it's actually, even in the scientific community, it's known to be something that happens, right? But at the time, this was not documented and certainly not validated. So people began to explain to Raymond Moody, Dr. Moody, their experiences. And because he had an ear that was attuned to the fact that nonsense is not always nonsensical, and sometimes it makes sense and has its own patterns, he began to discover in the very things that people had dismissed as being unintelligible, he began to find patterns, and that became the near-death experience. And he found that his patients would describe leaving their bodies, going through a tunnel, seeing a light, having deceased relatives take them through the tunnel and kind of usher them into another world. And they all describe something called a life review, where they look back at their lives, but through the eyes of the people that they hurt and that they helped. They had this very powerful experience during the life review. So all these things that for decades had been dismissed as being nonsense, Raymond actually saw that there were clear patterns in these stories. And from that, he coined the term near-death experience, and now it's been validated by thousands of accounts of being something that is a universal experience for 12 to 18% of people who die and then are resuscitated.
Wow. And you also did your own research. I mean, the fascinating thing about this is that we all see these movies where people are dying, and there's what you're expressing, Dr. Moody found, is often the picture that is painted in a lot of movies that depict these experiences. And what I'm hearing is that this is indeed what happens and what is reported from people that have had this experience, and that maybe the movies that we're seeing are actually depictions of something that is a little bit less fiction than everybody assumes. Now, when you did your research, because obviously we're all relying here on the testimony of an individual, right? Their memory, their perception, all these things. And so you had to use a little bit of a different process to do your part of the research. From what I understand, you had to interview family members, or did you also interview the people who had these experiences as well?
There are two different cases. In the case of people with near-death experiences, people died and then they came back. So, I could easily, Raymond and I have continued to do some near-death experience research. So we can interview people, obviously, when they come back from the afterlife, or whatever you want to call that other place that people go to, beyond the veil or beyond the threshold. Now, in my case, with those who are dying, all I could do really was track them until they passed on. And, it's interesting. None of the people in my research, were resuscitated or came back, so that they truly were. And so most of the transcripts, right now we're up to about 2,000 utterances, representing about 200 people. And most of it came from family members who transcribed the sentences for me, because I did not want to put a digital recorder at people's bedside, because I felt the material was just too private. And there were ethical issues too, of course. I mean, hospitals and hospices would not allow me to do that. But in most cases, I invited families to just keep journals, and then they could share what they wanted to. So, in the real sense, this is not super, super scientific research, but I was able to get enough speech and transcripts from people to start seeing real patterns and overlap in terms of what families were hearing. But what was so cool about doing the research this way really was involving the families rather than doing something very, rigorous and scientific and, with a recorder near the bedside. It really became a way that families became more attuned to really listen to their loved ones and beginning to kind of interact with the language in a way that was, for many people, very healing and very engaging.
I would imagine that to be the case. And so it sounds like there are, different contexts of dying that have happened, perhaps some, certainly the critically ill, because we never know when we're going to die. So it's hard to set up research to do this unless you know that somebody, and I totally get why you went with hospice. But on the near-death experiences, were those more kind of unexpected or accidental death situations, or were they also critically ill people?
Yeah, that's a good, with the near-death experience with them, that again is really Dr. Moody's research, but I've been involved since then interviewing people kind of to compare the near-death experience of language, like language in the afterlife, and comparing it with what I found in Words of the Threshold, which has been really interesting. But Raymond's research, there were people who would come into the hospital in a medical setting, but mostly hospitals. So many of them were not in hospice, but they were people who had heart attacks and were brought in to be resuscitated. But in some cases, they were already in the hospital and then had heart attacks in the course of other illnesses. But it was in a very, I guess some of them were at end of life. I think I have to double check this, but my understanding is that they were not primarily in hospice, where my end of language research with the language was more
I see.
hospice. You understand? Yeah, it's sort of like, because, you
Yeah,
can do that with a friend and they have a heart attack. They could be anywhere from 22 to, you know what I mean? Heart attacks can happen, unfortunately, anywhere at any time.
totally.
Yeah.
The reason I asked the question is I started to wonder, would there be a difference? And you may not have kind of looked into this enough to be able to answer this yet, but would there be a difference in the language of someone who has an accidental death? Because when you're chronically ill and you're going to die, you're kind of in a different mental state. There's a level of awareness of finality, or I would imagine, and maybe it happens in both situations. It's just how long you're in that state.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious, have you noticed any differences in the language between those two experiences?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And it's a question that I also had after doing this, several years. And there is a difference. So, if someone's but you see overlap. So, for example, one of the things that we see in the language of end of life is people begin to start talking about seeing deceased relatives in the room with them. And not only do they talk about seeing, I'm going to just for now call them the unseen, meaning that those of us who are not mediums or psychics and are on this plane don't generally see, right? People who are deceased. So many times those who are dying will start having conversations with the unseen, with, former spouses or friends or lovers who had passed on. So those kinds of conversations and having conversations with those who have passed on before us, those will also happen. For example, if someone had a car accident, which is very sudden, just like you said, very, quote, accidental, you will hear there are documented cases of people starting to talk to deceased loved ones on the scene. Does that make sense? Like, when they're at the accident scene, they'll start talking to the unseen.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So there's that kind of overlap. And there might be some overlap, like another common thing that happens at the end of life language is people start talking about the big trip. They're going somewhere. And that can also happen with accidental death. So, you will hear similar references. People might say, I have to go home now, meaning the big home, the home of heaven, or however you want to map where I believe we go. I do believe that somewhere we go or there's some kind of shift or transition or transformation. And people make a reference to home or taking a trip and definitely seeing visitors around them, seeing some kind of unseen taking. They're also called takeaway figures because they're taking them somewhere, maybe again back home or to heaven or the other dimension.
Wow.
So, yeah, I know. Well, that's what's incredible about doing this research, because this is one of the reasons I'm just not as afraid as I used to be about dying, because it's almost, matter of fact, if you look at WebMD, which is a pretty mainstream resource online, they talk about one of the indications that someone's going to die within 72 hours or soon is they start talking to deceased loved ones.
Mm.
And so it's even mainstream medicine now. Says that this is something that happens, and there's been a lot of recent research in the last 5 years that's documenting these very powerful kinds of exchanges between those who have passed on before us and are reaching out to us as we're dying to take us wherever it is we go. And it parallels what we hear from near-death experiencers who say that after they died, there were these people who took them through a tunnel to the other side. So, there is definitely overlap in terms of what we hear at accidental death and also what we hear from near-death experiencers who come back to this home. I guess we have a few homes.
Yeah, it really brings up a lot of what, these existential questions about, and I think that the religions have often tried to create their own stories or metaphors for whatever that experience is, and each religion sort of has its own way of depicting what happens when a person dies and what happens after that experience. And then there are others, who don't follow any of those religions, who might fall into the category of atheist, who just think that when you die, the lights turn off and that's it, and your body goes back into the earth. And, for me, like, you remember that show, The X-Files in the 90s?
Mm-hmm.
I would say, so there's the Scully character and the Mulder
Mm-hmm.
character. And I've always kind of go back and forth. At times of my life, I've been more like Scully, and at other times I've been more like Mulder.
Mm-hmm.
But we each have those two characters within us. And this idea of the unknown and what's possible in the unknown seems to bring those parts of us out. You're also, from what I understand, a poet.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to read a little bit of your poetry. And it's interesting when I hear unintelligible speech or nonsensical language, when I hear those words, I start to think about some of the poets that I love, or I start to think about, maybe even musical artists that I love, like Tori Amos is one of the ones that I love. And,
Me too.
when you hear someone even just singing a song, and the lyrics of a song might have a very specific meaning to the person that writes the song. And when we hear it, we may or may not even create the same meaning, right?
Right. And
So what is your take on that as a linguist? What do we do?
that's a great question. Thank you for that. Well, one of the differences between what we consider poetic and nonsensical language, it has to do with multiple meanings. So we know that with literal language, for example, if I say this is a cup, you and I both know what I mean by that. We both know it's a cup. We agree on what it is. But if I were to say what my dad said to me one day, oh, Lisa, there is so much so in sorrow. There is so much so in sorrow. That has multiple meanings, right? You may hear it and think, oh, that doesn't make sense to me at all. I don't know what your dad was talking about. Another person was saying, oh my God, he was expressing his grief to you in a very beautiful way. Or someone may say, no, what it really means is that there's no way that you can quantify grief. Or no, you know what I mean? There's just, so this continuum of language that goes from literal, which everyone agrees on its meaning. We all agree what a cup is. There'd be very little disagreement. But then we have metaphoric language, which might be something like she has lips like cherry wine. Well, we know that her lips are not cherry wine, but it's still, you and I could probably agree on what the meaning is there, right? We would have some that, it just means that they're delicious and juicy and very red, or,
And I want those. I want delicious cherry wine lips.
Right. Everybody wants those lips. You're kissing them or you want them for yourselves. They're delicious, right? So yeah. And so the metaphor has this incredible power to express something that, we could say she has very pretty lips, and it doesn't have that power because it doesn't engage our senses in the same way that metaphor does. Like oftentimes metaphor brings in what we feel, see, smell, hear, taste, right? It's more evocative and provocative. It's more rich. So we've got literal language, then we've got metaphoric, and then on the far end of the spectrum, we have nonsense, which the meanings are even more multiple. Because if I said something to you like, the lips are hanging on the walls upside down, flying senselessly, that's even maybe too sensible. But anyway, I might say something that's even more nonsensical than lips like cherry wine, and there'd be even more possible meanings of what it would mean. Does that make sense? So
yeah, so like something that's more bizarre, that
yes,
and more unexpected
yes,
connection.
yes. So as language gets more nonsensical, there are more multiple meanings. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me with this research is I've spoken a lot to psychic mediums. There are a lot of psychics in my life, and as I've done this research. And one of the things we know that psychics talk about is, let's say psychic A may sit with you and do a reading for you, and she'll see an apple. And then psychic B might see the shape of a heart. And then psychic C might see a poppy. But for each of them, those symbols, like for psychic A, apple always represents to her love. And for psychic B, a heart always represents love. And for the third person, a poppy does, right? or so that they're all tuning into a concept. Maybe, whoever they're reading for, it has to do with love, but each of them has their own personal kind of mythology or symbolism that they use when they do psychic readings that they've learned to understand. So when I've spoken to psychics, many of them have their own kind of vocabulary, for lack of a better word, or, iconography based on the symbols that they've learned to lean on when people come to them for readings. Other psychics will say, well, they learn to tune into kind of the symbolism of the person they're reading for, right? I might just say to the person, it's funny, I keep seeing an orange poppy. What does that mean to you? So the reason I'm mentioning that is I discovered that a lot of times with psychics, it's in the realm of multiple meanings, right? It's not in the realm where there's only one-to-one meaning. So it seems to me that when we start getting to more cross-dimensional experience and more transcendent experience, we start seeing more and more instances of multiple meanings emerging. So I feel like your question is really just right on target in terms of what I've discovered and noticed about cross-dimensional language. Yeah.
Rumi said, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground, and maybe you've been trying all of them. You want to feel strong and grounded, and at the same time, you want that creative energy to flow freely through you. But something seems to be preventing it, and you're sick of the struggle. Maybe you found a little taste of the surrender that you're looking for while doing yoga, or meditating, or on a retreat somewhere. But how's it possible to find in real life? If you're ready to tap into the wisdom of the body, and you want to build the feeling of community, I have a group for you, Body Church. Well, it's not really a church. It's a self-care membership program focused on your body, all of it. It's a gathering, a circle of the support you have been craving for you to dive into the intelligent functioning and poetry of your body more deeply than you've ever been able to before. If you want to be part of this very unique group program, head over to my website at heathergrish.com and see if we have a spot for you to try it out. That's heathergrych.com. We're starting to enroll people right now. It makes me wonder, I'm glad that you brought up psychics because I definitely am not a psychic. I've had maybe one or two instances where I've said something that was weird and I can't explain how I knew it. But I don't personally have that experience. I'm a very tangible world person. And yet I also am a poet. And so I have the experience of, channeling language in some way. It makes me curious if there are certain maybe kinds of people that are more tapped into metaphoric language than others.
Yeah, I think there definitely are. I don't know enough about how it works, but I think there are people more tapped in. So, for example, with the end of life language, there are certain family members that will hear their loved ones speak in metaphor. And, for example, I'm getting ready for a big trip. Help me get in the car. I have to go. And some family members will just freak out like, God, Daddy is crazy. What's he talking about? Right. But then there'll be other family members like, wait, I think Daddy's talking about a trip. I think the trip he's talking about is his dying. Or nurses. I had one nurse I interviewed and she was telling the story of one of her patients who was saying, I need my Jetta. And the wife was freaking out, like, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? And that's his car and he's in bed. Why does he need the car? What's he talking about? And then the nurse bent over and said, Sir, get in your car all gassed up and ready to go so you can have an easy drive, right? So this nurse was tapped into metaphor and the guy totally relaxed, right? Because she was entering his world and speaking his language. And, I believe that metaphor is universal in the end, that we are critters that are very much metaphorically driven in many ways. And that's why advertisers know it, right? They use it all the time. But, we'll see metaphor in our dreams and our bodies, right? Our bodies speak in metaphors all the time. You've heard this, my legs are hurting but it's really because I'm having trouble standing up for myself, right? Many times our shoulders are where we hold all our shoulds. And, many times our bodies are speaking in metaphors. Oh God, I'm so upset today. And your stomach is hurting, right? So our bodies speak to us in metaphors. So You had asked me a couple minutes ago, are there some people who are more comfortable in the realm of metaphor who use that more often than others? And at first I said, yes, I think so. But I think it's just that some make the connection between the reality and the presence of metaphor in our lives and the ability to articulate it, right? So I actually think metaphor is a pretty universal human structure, right? But I think that not everyone is able to recognize it or articulate it until some people need it pointed out to them. Like the person goes, oh God, my stomach is so upset. My stomach is so upset. Well, a good therapist will say, well, is there anything that's upsetting you right now? Is there something that's upsetting you? So I do think we're actually very metaphoric critters, but we don't always know it.
Yeah, and there's also a difference between accepting a metaphor and sort of hearing it and processing it internally versus jumping into the metaphor and continuing the metaphor like you were talking about. It makes me think a lot about my kid who's 3.5, who's just, all the imaginative speech that's going on, which I guess is a little bit different than metaphor.
Yes and no.
Well, because I find that, if I don't relax into the way he's speaking and the little story he wants to tell, and, if he wants us to kind of improvise and create this little narrative with him, that things just go better when I surrender into that energy than when I try to take everything literally and go, no, that thing is not there, and like keep trying to correct him all the time.
Yes, I think that's another really, really good point. And I think that that is true on so many levels, right? We know that how important it is to enter into other people's worlds, right? And we do that through language. That's called getting in rapport, right? And so, when people are dying, the dying are going to respond so much more beautifully when they're talking about, oh, look at the green landscape over there. And instead of saying, Dad, that's just a hospital wall, you say instead, yeah, that landscape is beautiful. What do you see, Papa? And in the same way with our children, I think whatever our experiences and whatever language portrays as our experience, I think it's really important to step into that world. And, we know in terms of our friendships and in terms of our relationships with our partners and with everything, with our coworkers, that, we all map the world really differently. And one of the ways we know is, some of us speak, much more visually, have many more visual predicates. And this comes from neurolinguistic programming, of course. And some of us are much more auditorily driven and speak about the things in terms of what we hear and resonance. And other people are much more driven by how they experience the world through their sense of feeling and touch. And it's more multi-layered than that, but we all sort of have certain preferences. And so if we really listen to people's language, and, if someone says, I'm really feeling it right now, then, if you respond to them by like, well, I got what you're saying, right? This comes from NLP, but, I got it, and if you match where someone is in terms of getting something rather than seeing something, if you match where somebody is, everyone's going to feel much more reassured. And that's also true with being in alternate realities and or imagination. And, I think imagination is very real. And we know for when we take metaphors and really, or even just if we wanted to say imagination and just go with it, there's so much we can learn about who we are and who the other person is. And, literal reality is very limited, but the imagination is what has been at the basis of all of our new creations. So yeah, I would keep entering into your child's world, and we should enter into the world of those who are dying. Once we start correcting the dying and telling them that we know what's real, we're lying. We don't know what life is at, what things are like at the threshold, but the dying know. So in the case of those who are dying, I think it's more honest to step into their world, right? To step into what people are seeing and saying. So for example, my dad, who didn't believe in angels, he was a very hardcore skeptic. 3 days before he died, when he said the angels say there are 3 days left. I'm like, Dad, angels? You're talking about angels? He said, yes, the angels say 3 days left. And I could have rolled my eyes, or anybody could have rolled their eyes, right? Who's skeptical. But of course the question is, really, Daddy? Wow, tell me about the angels. And indeed, my dad died 3 days later. And so I think there's so much we can learn from what we think of as non-literal experience, indeed.
Wow. So your father was talking about something happening 3 days later and he died 3 days. Oh, that is amazing.
Yes, it is amazing, and it's what propelled me to this research. And what's even more amazing, Heather, is it's not that unusual. And that's why the conversations that seem so scary at the end of life, because, a lot of us, understandably, we're losing someone we love, and dying is not pretty. I mean, it's really hard to witness. But if we can keep our hearts and our ears open, many times we can become witness to some really remarkable language and experiences.
I'm kind of curious. I mean, because if I use my imagination and try to envision myself at the time of my death, and if I even try to go there, I just immediately feel this tremendous fear take over.
Mm.
And it makes me wonder, have you observed, or have the people that you've interviewed observed that there is a fear at that moment?
So what I've heard, and again, I'm not as much of, I'm not a medical expert in death and dying, but what I've heard and what I saw in my father is that, do you remember when you gave birth?
Oh, yes.
Hard thing. And, it's not easy. It's hard. And there are moments, I mean, some of us, are blessed to have really easy natural childbirths, but most of us don't, from what I've heard. I certainly didn't. And there were
Mine was not easy.
Okay, good. So you know what I'm talking about,
I do.
and you can validate it. But then there's kind of a point where there's this kind of surrender. There's a point for a lot of people where it does get a little easier. But what it is what I've heard about with dying, everyone's different, but it's not easy. I mean, there are points it's really scary, but then it's almost like our unconscious mind or our mind is working with us to help us make it easier. And oftentimes it's the point when people start seeing deceased loved ones circle the bed and come, or the angels come, that there really is a sense of comfort and ease, because suddenly there's like this really profound surrender. And it's a level of surrender that, we all want to think we can do naturally, during childbirth or any time. And it's really hard to get to that space, right? It's a very high, elevated level of surrender. But a lot of people, thank God for morphine, because that does help with the dying process. And definitely there are times it's really hard. But there's like this breakthrough point for a lot of people where they start describing just beautiful landscapes and a kind of peace and beauty that's also very typical in the description of people who have near-death experiences. And what people who have near-death experiences say, that while they're still completely in their bodies, it's painful because the body experiences pain. But once they move out of their bodies and really into the spiritual dimension, the pain is gone, right? Because then they're connected to spirit. And so I think that's true. And like with my father, for example, he would go through these periods where he was in his body, and thank God for morphine and the drugs, because it does take the pain away. But then there'd be periods where he was, I could see he even explained it, of being above his body, of being out of his body. And so I think to say that, death is a beautiful experience, it's just this beautiful transition, I think that's as much of a non-truth as saying, birth is such a beautiful experience, it's so natural. It is a beautiful experience, and it's also really hard. And I think dying is similar.
Mm. Yeah, it's like the two extremes of wonder and awe and pain all at the same time.
Exactly. And they're both, my belief is now, after doing this research, and I wouldn't have told you this 10 years ago, but my belief now is just like when we are giving birth to our children, we're giving birth to something. My experience now is that when we die, we're entering a new dimension, or we're giving birth to something new in ourselves. So it is like a transition. And, a lot of how I feel about living my life now as a 61-year-old woman is I want to live my life in a way that I'm more comfortable with transitional states. Like, we opened up this conversation today just when we were casually talking before we started recording that, I recently went through a divorce about a year ago. And, in a way, this divorce has been a form of death. And so I've had to really learn to work with what it means to be in transition, right? To have something die and have faith that something new is being born. And I think the more we can do that in our lives, the more we can practice that, kind of maybe the more grace we can go into the dying, we can go into the dying process with a little bit more grace. And also just have faith that we're moving into something more beautiful. Now, my father, who was terrified of dying, terrified. He was one of those people that have to have 4 drinks on the airplane because he was so scared of something happening. They gave him morphine, which is great. But I remember I went into his room one day while he was, I think he was about a week away from dying. And I said, "How you doing, Papa?" And he said, "I'm working on myself, honey. I'm working on myself." And I get this feeling that on some very deep level, he was really trying to come to peace with what was happening. And one of the many things he said that made me so interested in this research is about 3 days before he died. Well, no, it was before the angel thing, maybe 4 days before. He was talking to his secretary. She called him and he was able to take the phone call. And she said, "How you doing, Morty?" He said, "This is very interesting, Alice. I've never done this before." And I remember hearing that and thinking, I wonder what this is. Does he know he's dying? Or is there another this that's going on that I have no idea about what it is? So that's, I think, and this is very common in the language of people who are dying. They refer to this kind of mysterious this or it. Or, like one person in a coma said to their loved one, they came out of the coma, turned to them and said, "It's not what you think." And it's sort of that mysterious it or mysterious this, right? It's not what you think. And then she went back into the coma, right? And left her loved one stunned.
Oh, what a cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger, right? Right. So it's not. So I am afraid of pain. Like when I think of coronavirus, I've definitely been cautious about COVID. I'm not out there just running around, right? I'm definitely scared, and I'm scared of pain. Like the idea of not being able to breathe scares me. But the thought of dying does not scare me because I really believe that we're going somewhere else or that there's a transition or something happens that's very remarkable. And I'm grateful for morphine and the thing. Well, just like when you give birth. I don't know if you took any meds. I took a little bit. And, I'm grateful those were there because it hurt.
Yes.
But I don't regret at all that miracle when my daughter was born. She's 26 now. But that miraculous moment was worth everything and still remain. I would never, ever undo any of the pain of birth, ever undo any of that. I'm just so grateful for my incredible daughter. So, I think it's not unsimilar.
In Ayurveda, the sort of idea of change and transition and when things are irregular is this idea of vata dosha, and that's the air and space elements. And they're sort of behind all of the movement that takes place in nature and in matter. And so this idea of when you increase the vata to a certain level, oftentimes people do experience pain and oftentimes they experience pleasure, because even something like mania in Ayurveda would be considered a high vata condition, that you could have too much sort of prana, if you will. So this idea of losing your body totally is like the ultimate of the vata experiences that we could have as an individual.
Yeah.
So, because your work is so fascinating, and just for the listeners, I'm sure that, we may have people who've experienced something like this with a loved one, or may have a loved one who's in that situation right now even. Would you have any advice for them in communicating with someone who's in a situation where they are at the threshold?
Well, I would say that one of the first things is to enter into the experience, as hard as this might be, as something sacred. We walk into the birthing room knowing it's sacred, when a woman gives birth. But we don't always walk that way into the room when someone's dying. So to at least somewhere in one's heart to see it as a sacred experience, even though, of course, there's so much grief oftentimes associated. And then to enter into the world of the person who's dying, kind of do what you do with your child, just suspend disbelief and allow yourself to enter into that world. And you might be surprised what you discover when you do that. And, I started thinking of it with my dad that it was like a second language. As a linguist, I studied different languages, foreign languages. I learned how to study another language. Well, it was almost like I walked into, my dad's language, into his experience. I walked into it almost as if it were like another language, and to just not judge it. I would never judge Chinese as being weird and crazy. It's different than what I know, but, it's still a beautiful, logical language, right? So, and, validate the person's experiences and words. So whatever the person says, step into their world and validate it. Ask questions. One of my biggest regrets is when my dad started talking about the angels, because I was so in disbelief that my dad was saying it and was wondering what was going on. I wish now I said, "Oh, what do the angels look like, Daddy?" Or how many angels are he? And I wish I had asked more questions. So ask questions, and then assume that your loved one hears you, even if the person is unresponsive, because we know from a lot of research, and then I've heard it from near-death experiencers, that hearing is the last sense to go, and people hear a lot more than we think. And God forbid, please don't argue about who's going to get the sofa when Daddy dies. Don't do that while Daddy's dying. While you're there in the room with him, I've heard some horrible stories of families getting into arguments about finances as their loved one is. And, it's sacred time, and really treat it sacredly, and know that the person can probably hear, a lot of what you're saying on some level. They're hearing you. So say lots of loving, kind, generous words if you can.
Thank you so much for that. That's so helpful. And I hope that the listeners really appreciate that too. I suspect they do. Lisa, if people want to learn more about your book and your work, what's the best way to find you?
Final Words Project, all one word, finalwordsproject.org is probably the best way. And then my contact information is there. Also, I have a free excerpt from my book, Words at the Threshold, so people can get an excerpt and read a little bit. And also, the website has tons of information. I wanted to make it a free resource for people. So I think there's a lot there to hopefully learn from and enjoy.
Wow. Thank you for your fascination in the subject, your courage to dive into it and to share what you've learned with the rest of us. And thank you so much for being here today.
It was a real pleasure, Heather. Thank you. Thank you for your work as well.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.